All right, we look like we're live here at MythVision Podcast. We're talking about the Book of Acts with a historian, scholar who's published extensively on the field of New Testament studies and other areas as well. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. Is Acts fake history? What is going on here? Should we trust it to be historically reliable? And if it is reliable in some ways, why is that? Where did this information come from? Does this person have a propagandistic game to play to convince the reader, maybe Theophilus, of their particular belief system or their Christ movement? What are they doing? What's going on? And so I have a scholar, Dr. Richard Carrier, joining us today, who's actually wrote an article recently. I've been going through it again. How we know Acts is a fake history. Welcome back to MythVision, Dr. Carrier.
Yeah, glad to be back on.
Just, I guess, if you were to put, because I almost want to read your bio, but you have several books. You have your website, which is where this article is for people who are interested. I mean, I've got, Jesus from Outer Space, Proving History, and then Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ right here. And I was trying to find your others, but I literally can't see.
Yeah,
there's so many books.
There's 9. I now have 9 books. All but one are available in Audible as well, so people who want to hear them instead of read them. The 9th one, Audible, is coming, but it won't be read by me. It's going to be read by a special celebrity. So that will be announced, I hope, by the end of this year, I think. So finally have the audio of Jesus from Outer Space available. Other than that, yeah, electronic edition and all of that. But my website, richardcarrier.info, people can go there, find my Twitter feed, my Facebook feed, all my books, all my writings, and links to learn about my courses. So I have a variety of text-based courses, but I'm also starting to roll out courses with MythVision, which are video-based courses. And they're great. Like I love the way we've organized those courses. The video is good. The syllabi are good. So the one we've got is New Testament Studies for Everyone, which does touch on this issue of the Book of Acts. And then how would you approach scholarship about it? Like, how would you approach this question that we're talking about today from an informed perspective without having to go get a college degree and all of that?
Right.
And that's what the New Testament Studies for Everyone is about. It's about giving people some of those basic skills, teaching you some of the resources that are available that you can use to leverage your ability and your knowledge, and just fill you in on what is the mainstream position, where is the field on these things right now. And I think that generally the trend on Acts is with me on this. I was just reading, in fact, maybe I can read it out again, but in my article, the one that you linked to, I linked to the Westar Institute's summary of their study, because they came out with a study of Acts. They published a book on it.
Okay.
And it lists all of their conclusions. And I think that came out, I can't remember when that came out. Oh, it was, let's see. It concluded in 2011. I can't remember when they published the book, but just looking back over their list of things that they found, and the Westar Institute is, people recognize it as the Jesus Seminar. That's a misnomer, because the Jesus Seminar was just one project that they did and that they finished years and years ago. But the group that does these projects is the Westar Institute, and of which I'm now a fellow of the Institute. And they did a bunch of other studies. Once they finished the Jesus Project, they did the Book of Acts, they did the Origins of Christianity and things like that. And they're doing a bunch of other stuff too. But anyway, they did this Acts seminar, and I hadn't read like their report summary in like maybe 10 years, right? Because I used the report and the reports for my book on the history of the city of Jesus when I wrote a chapter about this, summarizing a lot of other scholars. And you'll notice I cite tons of scholars, like some of the leading writers of commentaries on Acts are saying the same things that I am about the Book of Acts, that it is essentially historical fiction. It's more on the fiction side than it is on the historical side. It's more of a religious adventure novel. And in fact, it has more in common with religious adventure novels, with actual novels like fiction of the period, than it does with histories of the period. It looks a lot more like a novel than it does a history. If you've read the histories, and you can really tell the difference between the way they're written and how they're composed and all of that.
This is an interesting point. I hope we can get into some of those details.
Yeah, we will,
as we go in, because your article, and I've literally referenced it in the description of the video. So if you're watching this later and it's not live, you can check it out. I'm going to go ahead and post this in the chat just so everybody can at least put the tab on your computer. You're going to want to read this later. I actually contacted Dr. Carrier because I'm actually a subscriber to what he has, what he publishes. And this came out, and I had just recently done some of this stuff on Richard Purvo's books. Scratch his reputation. I'm talking about his work. Okay.
Yeah,
and
scholarship.
wow, what a heck of a book. I mean, he's written several books on Acts. He really knows a thing or two. And so I started reading that, and then came across your article, and I went, this was really well written. One of my favorite parts right at the beginning was how Christian apologists, and it's usually apologists doing this, because I know Christian scholars who are Christian, how you want to define that. I tend to say if they claim to be Christian, they're Christian. I don't have this.
Right. Yeah, the whole idea of if you don't believe in Nicene Christianity, you're not a real Christian. That's bogus. Yeah, that's definitely
like Dominic Crossan. You reference him, the power parables. So he, will literally take jabs at Luke Acts as propagandistic and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And I consider him a form of a Christian. He claims to be a form of a Christian. So
I think he's a pastor as well, isn't he? Doesn't he have some ordination? I can't remember.
I know he was a monk.
Had been. Okay, yeah.
Yes, he was a monk. And in fact, he tells me to call him Dom, because when he was, a monk, his name was Dominique. Or he went by the name Dominique. So he just says, call me Dom.
Yeah.
He takes very clear factual approaches on trying to understand what the material is. What he draws ontologically is a whole different question at the end of the day. But I love what he says.
Right.
And he would be on the same page as you when it comes to Acts. But other Christians who are apologists if this isn't history, I'm going to word it this way. If this book is what you're suggesting, they are in huge trouble. Their entire worldview is in huge trouble.
The conservatives, the fundamentalists. Right. I think, there's forms of liberal Christianity that can survive accepting the Bible is all allegory and myth and has wisdom messages in it and things like that. God's special way of communicating isn't through rational, objective history, right? If you completely reinterpret the New Testament, you can rescue a semblance of Christianity. But you're right, the fundamentalists need these things to be true, because if it's not history, if this stuff is being made up, that contaminates the rest of the text, right? Because they're like, well, that means then the Gospels are making stuff up, and then what have we got, right? You go into Paul, and then I don't know, everything's kind of wishy-washy, and there maybe Paul's making up stuff, we don't know. So it has a cascade of problems, and so that's why it's all man's on deck, right? This is they have to defend the bulwarks, and Acts is one of them. And of course, the article we're talking about, that premise the discussion on this one particular Christian apologist who very explicitly says what their apologetic mission is, which is that they need to believe that Jesus is God. To do that, they need to prove that the first disciples, the first apostles, believed Jesus was God. And to do that, they need the book of Acts, right, to be a historically reliable text, and not, as most mainstream scholars now conclude, a second century piece of propaganda, right? And of course, there's not even an internal logic to the thing. I pointed out in the article, like, actually, Acts never says Jesus is God. That's a mistake that often.
But you also point out, like, he does a straw man and some fallacy, because he assumes it's either he's completely man and man only, or he's all the way God, Trinitarian. And it's like, oh my gosh, several scholars point out the boundaries, right?
This is a common apologetic move, which is you say either one thing or the other, and then you refute one thing, and therefore it's the other, right? Like, this is a common, Christian apologetics is practically built out of this methodology. And this is a good example where he says either Acts says Jesus is God, or Acts says he was not divine at all, he's just an ordinary guy. And it's like, no, and that just most mainstream scholars come to the opposite conclusion, that there's an excluded middle there. Right. Which actually is what the earliest documents, Paul and the book of Acts, and frankly, all of the Gospels, even the Gospel of John, we could do a whole thing on that. How I don't think even the Gospel of John is claiming that Jesus is God. But that's more debated. But anyway, the book of Acts isn't, because the view was that Jesus was a divine being, like he was supernatural, he was pre-existent, he was godlike, he had godlike powers assigned to him, he had some of God's authority assigned to him by God, and all of this stuff. But that's not the same thing as being identical to God, right? And so that's what the mainstream view is that was the earliest view. Axe is totally in alignment with that. But once you admit that that's the case, then his whole apologetic argument that it's either all God or nothing divine at all, that argument falls apart, and you're stuck in the middle where he can't get to where he wants to go. And that's why he has to create that false dichotomy to do that.
I don't want to get lost in that because there's some details about this article that I just want people to read, because I'm really want to get into the data of why is this book not history, factual, it's not propagandistic to try and like force a path. And one of the things you said in the intro of this that I was getting to, that was my favorite part, is how you literally say like they have to ignore the 20 other book of acts of various fictions. And this is something that Dr. Richard C. Miller said. And by the way, he loves your work. Huge fan. Maybe sometime I can get you and him together on to talk. He pointed this out too. It seems to be something that's happening in my thinking over time, and I'm always learning, is we have this overwhelming weight of data from Christians, self-proclaimed Christians, who are writing what we would clearly say fan fiction. They're creating narratives, having fun, having Jesus be a kid killing another kid to turn into birth, like crazy, cool, fun, interesting novels. And
the disciple John commands bed bugs to march out of his bed. Yeah, there's like
or the giant cross coming out of the. So I say like the gist is, we want to create narrative around our guy. Whether he existed or not is not the question today. It's simply like, here's our person that we're going to create fiction about. But we get back to these supposed untouchable, sealed by some invisible power that says, these books, however, are the real deal. Everyone else is full of it.
It's the ignoring of context. This is another apologetic trap. And the true context is that if you step aside and forget Christian faith claims, like the whole idea of the canon and all of that, and you just look at it like books of Acts were normally fiction, like 10-1, right? like more than, no, it's more like 20-1. Even if ours is true, but it's like the weirdest, rarest exception of this genre of literature among Christians. And when you look at it in that context, you go, well, hold on. Christians are just making up acts willy-nilly left and right. Why should we believe this one is somehow the only one that was a properly researched history? And that doesn't mean you need to answer that question. And apologists like Boyd will attempt that, right? And then, critics like me will come out and expose the fallacies and what they're attempting to do. When you look at the evidence supports, not only is the prior probability support Acts being fiction, but the evidence within Acts itself, our book of Acts itself, confirms that it's fiction. Like all the evidence trends towards fiction, not towards history. And that's even apart from the fact that there's another version of our Acts. And I don't know if I sort of mention it briefly in that article, but people often don't realize that there is another version of Acts, our Acts, that's like 10 to 20% longer and has a whole bunch of extra stuff in it. But it's otherwise identical apart from minor changes. And that one was just happened to be excluded from the canon for whatever reasons. But that means that like people were willing to even add fiction to Acts. So you keep fictionalizing it, like keep altering it to add more and more crazy stuff.
I was reading the Hermeneia by Purvo on Acts, and he points out, I mean, there's so much in there. You can't just casually read that Hermeneia. It's like it's
I mean, all Hermeneia commentaries are heavy. But they're all excellent. Even when they're by people I don't agree with, they're academically rigorous, and so they are the best commentaries to go to. You don't have to agree with them and everything, but they're invaluable to consult because they've done their work. On every aspect of it. He
brings this up. He says it's like there's different versions of that extended version where it's from like 6 to 7 up to 10%, like larger, and wild stuff appears in that other model that we don't see in our version in our Gospels or in our New Testaments today.
And that centers our context, because we step back and look at the context. We're looking at a different thing than the Christians want you to see, right? They don't want you to see the context. And when you do, they'll come up with a whole bunch of excuses why you should ignore the context, which is not what you should do as a historian. You should pay attention to the context and take it seriously.
So let's jab right in. Let's get into these. We'll
Yeah,
get
let
to
me
super
let me
chats in a
read
bit.
the list. There's this 10. So at the Westar Institute, they have these 10 things, and they spent 10 years on this. So this is a committee, probably about 100 scholars or more overall. And not just anybody can join. You have to be fully credentialed, and you have to be nominated, and they have to like put you in, accept you as for the fellowship. So these are like serious vetted scholars over 10 years came to a pretty good consensus. Like there's not much dissent among them of these 10 things about the book of Acts. And so let me read them. I'm just reading them
Please do. I'm
verbatim.
gonna make you full screen so everybody can see you.
Okay, yeah. The use of Acts as a source for history has long needed critical assessment. Yes. Acts was written in the early decades of the 2nd century. This is, Christian apologists hate this, but this is the growing consensus now, is that Acts is an early 2nd century text. It was not written in the 1st century. The author of Acts used the letters of Paul as sources. That's important because the author of Acts contradicts the letters of Paul a lot, and now we know it's on purpose. Except for, they say, the letters of Paul, no other historically reliable source can be identified for Acts, for the Christian parts of Acts, that is. Acts can no longer be considered an independent source for the life and mission of Paul. Contrary to Acts 1-7, Jerusalem was not the birthplace of Christianity. Acts constructs its story on the model of epic and related literature. The author of Acts created names for characters as storytelling devices. Acts constructs its story to fit ideological goals, and Acts is a primary historical source for the 2nd century Christianity, not for 1st century Christianity. So I agree with all of those things. And those are all the things that I aim to prove in chapter 9 of On the Historicity of Jesus. I focus more on the fiction aspect. Like we can look at story after story after story, and we can see the literary basis of them. And once you see the literary basis of them, it doesn't make any sense to believe that this is history.
Right. Okay, couple things before we dive into Q&A, and I just want to throw it out there. Come on, Dr. Carrier. I mean, look at the opening of Luke. I mean, it's clearly a history. You're just wanting to sin. You just want to deny God and Christ. Luke tells you in his preface, this is a history, and he's giving you the actual facts, right? And Luke wrote this, right? I mean, you're in total denial. Of course, I'm being silly here. Tackle that big question that even scholars tend to wrestle over about this issue, about the preface of Luke.
Yeah, so the usual apologetic line is, oh, this looks just like a preface to a history book, right? And it does. In fact, it deliberately does, but it conspicuously lacks all the actual things that you would find in history. So it's mimicking history while not actually, right? And I'll give you an example
some of those things as you go
right.
along.
Yeah. So to give you an example, so we have lots of prefaces. Historians in their prefaces will usually say who they are. Not always, but usually they'll say who they are, what their sources were. Sometimes they'll mention, they'll name the sources. One of my favorite examples is Arian. Christian apologists love to rag on Arian because he wrote this history of Alexander the Great 500 years later. How could he write a history about Alexander the Great 500 years later? Why would you trust him, you silly historians? And it's like, because Arian says who he is. He says what his method was. He explains what his method was. He names his sources, and he says, I'm only using 3 eyewitness books written by people who marched with Alexander. I'm going to just say what they say where they agree, and where they disagree, I'll point out where they disagree. And we know he doesn't follow that method, consistently, but he does it. Like there's points where he'll say, oh, well, this author said that there was a magical snake, and this other author said it was just a raven, right? Like, so there'll be things like that. Yeah. But it'll be this methodological consciousness, but naming sources, naming who they are, explaining to the reader why you should even believe anything they're saying in rational terms, not faith-based terms. When you look at Luke's preface, he never says who he is, never explains who he is, never explains how he knows anything he knows. He says he's faithfully reproducing a tradition handed down to him, but we know that's not even true because he contradicts all his prior sources, Matthew and Mark, for example. So he's not faithfully doing it, but he claims to be. But he doesn't name them either. He doesn't say, hey, Mark and Matthew wrote these books. I'm using them as sources, and this is how I'm going to decide between them where they disagree or whatever. He doesn't do that, right? He never names his sources. He never explains what method he used to decide what to write. Why did he contradict them? Why did he make more stuff up? Why did, he doesn't tell you. So the preface looks like a history, but it doesn't do any of the actual things that a real history would do. So this is very much kind of like a fictional history. The way it already from the beginning, the way it's constructed does not look like an actual history.
You actually bring up Plutarch's kind of critique of Herodotus, and Herodotus, for his time and age, he does an okay job. I mean, he does not bad. Of course, the father of
For
history.
his time, yeah.
Yeah, but even while Plutarch jabs at him for kind of the methodological, he crosses over certain barriers and mixes up genres and stuff in the way that he does stuff.
But even Herodotus is better than Acts. Even Herodotus will sometimes name sources. He'll sometimes express skepticism when he's not sure about a story. He'll talk about
Salmoxis.
Right. He'll tell alternative versions of the story. And that's a good example where he actually tells you, oh, this version of the story I have from the Greeks who don't like them. And this version of the story I have from them, right? So he's telling you where the biases are. Like, he's doing a critical history here. It's very primitive. It's very simplistic in his critical method, because he's practically the first one doing it. But he's doing more than we get in the Book of Acts. We don't get anything like that in the Book of Acts. So even Herodotus, whom historians like me deem to be as far as reliability goes, even he is like, stars better than the Book of Acts by comparison. We might get into some of the details of, I don't know what you want to get into next, but there's one thing I know, the one thing that Christians always cite to try and contradict what I just said. And we can jump into that if you want.
Go for
it. Which is that he gets trivia correct, right? Luke, the name of a magistrate, the title, the word used in this particular region for magistracy, the geography, his geography is decent. He gets like the correct people who were in charge in certain places at the right times and all of this stuff. So he gets like when he dates John the Baptist's ministry, he lists a bunch of facts, none of which have anything really to do with John the Baptist or Christians, but he lists a bunch of facts and go, oh, look, all those facts. He's dating something. That's what historians did. He's dating something. Curiously, he's not dating anything to do with Jesus. He only dates the reign of John the Baptist. And he does it in a traditional way where he lists all of these things. But this is it. That's the only time he ever dates anything, other than the Quirinius census, which is that's a dateable event. But even what he does with that is ridiculous. But all of this stuff has nothing to do with Christianity, right? This is all incidental color detail. And I cite and I quote an author and scholar in the article we're talking about, where he says, like, well, I've read detective novels that were 100% accurate in all the trivial details, like the names of politicians and things like that, and yet we're total fiction, right? So like it's curious that the only time we can confirm anything is accurate in Acts is when it is basically stuff that you get from the ancient version of Wikipedia, and the only time every time he talks about Christian history, nothing is corroborated. So what you're looking at is you've got a historian here who's making up Christian history and putting it into a skeleton of real history, where none of the Christian stuff is corroborated, but all of the incidental stuff is corroborated because he's getting it from reference works. And I talk about in the article about these were commonly available, like all the reference works that Luke would need to put these references in there without any reference to Christian history were widely available. It would have been in any library, and almost every major city in ancient Rome at that time, the Roman Empire at that time, had a major library. Libraries were open to the public. You couldn't check out books, but you could use them in your research libraries. You could use them in the library. And one of the biggest ones we know about is Josephus. We know he used Josephus like mad. And used him poorly. That's the other thing, is he's bad at even cribbing from Josephus. He's bad at it. But that's how we know he used him, because how he screws up can only be explained by having screwed up reading Josephus. There's no other plausible explanation for it. So yeah, he's throwing that color detail in to give the veneer of historical reality. But it is conspicuous that all the real history that you actually want to know about, none of that is corroborated, and all of it's implausible. And that's the stuff that's highly literary in its construction and so on. So even the one attempt that apologists will try to make for, Acts is a really reliable history, actually the evidence proves the opposite, is that he's sort of good at doing research in encyclopedias. That's basically all you can show for that. It doesn't mean that he's telling you the truth about any of the other stuff.
I enjoy the book, of course. It's fun. It's interesting. Certain spots of it are more fun to me than others. But so we're talking about sources. We would say Acts has the Gospels, some form, probably all three for all we know. We didn't dive into the Marcion / debate of what's happening there yet. Maybe you can make a comment on this, because there seems to be a big issue between what kind of axe do we have? Do we trust that Marcion actually had a primitive version and that they fluffed it out and padded it to try and reverse Marcion? Or is Marcion taking things out of what was already a thorough book of Acts, Gospel of Luke or whatever, or really Luke, because I'm not sure about the Acts part when it comes to Marcion, but it seems like there's a debate amongst scholars on what the deal is with there. Do you want to make a brief comment on that before I dive into any other material?
Yeah, only to say that I don't have strong opinions in that debate yet. I'm watching the debate. I don't think any side of the debate has a strong case. I think the evidence is too poor,
Right.
but I'm persuadable on that. So I'm sitting around waiting for people to rally around a position. I'm not sure whether Luke Acts is something that Marcion edited, or whether he had the original and other people, the canonical, the creators of the edition that we have, if they're the ones who edited it. And this is complicated by the fact that we have that other version. Yep. And that other version, it's of Luke Acts. So both Luke and Acts are longer. They have weirder things in them. Well, where did those come from? And I'll give you an example of the problem here, how this is vexing. So we know Luke used Josephus, I just mentioned, the Antiquities particularly, the Antiquities of Josephus, which was published in the early 90s AD. This is why we think early 2nd century for Luke Acts. It's one of many reasons we think that. But that's one of the pieces of it. But so we know he used that, and we can point to specific examples of where he's lifting material from Josephus. Now, in the longer version, the version of Luke Acts, it's not in our Bible. And we see this in Codex Bezdai, which is one of the early medieval manuscripts, the complete Bibles that we have. And it has this isn't Book of Acts, but it's Gospel of Luke, so it illustrates my point. In the empty tomb narrative, in that version of Luke, there is a verse added that says that the tomb of Jesus took 20 men to open. Now that's ahistorical nonsense. There's no way that any tomb of Jesus would require 20 men to open this tomb. That would be a dumb way to design a tomb. But also that's not the case. But it's almost, not exactly word for word, but nearly word for word, a lift from Josephus in describing the doors to the temple of God. He says the temple of God required 20 men to open, and he refers to a miracle in which they opened automatically, implying that God had left the temple, right? It was the idea that, God is now abandoning the Jews, and this was a portent for the end and destruction of Jerusalem, yada, yada, right? But here Josephus is saying, metaphor for God leaving the temple, abandoning, doing that, and it's the doors with 20 men. So someone adds a line from Josephus to the tomb of Jesus, making the tomb of Jesus the temple of God. And Jesus leaves the temple of God just as God left the temple of the Jews. And so they're creating this whole, rather brilliant, metaphor and analogy, not history. There's no witness to this. This isn't eyewitness testimony. This is just more literary expansion, more fan fiction and all of that. But why did they know to lift this material from Josephus? Right. So this is the thing is we don't have a version of Luke Acts that's missing all the stuff from Josephus. So could Codex Bezdai be the original? And then those lines were cut because they were considered too embarrassing or they didn't like them or whatever. I don't know. And there's a lot of scholars who've wrestled with this, have written whole books on this question. And they don't come to a conclusion either. They're not sure. And so that complicates the whole narrative about what was Marcion doing. And I think it's also complicated by the fact that we don't have Marcion. Mm-hmm. We have his enemies talking about Marcion, and I don't entirely trust them to be telling the truth all the time. So, and there's a lot of arguments from omission that I think are weak. And so there's a lot of problems with that. So I don't think that question is resolvable now. Definitely there's hinky stuff going on involving the Marcionite edition leading into our edition, but I don't think we can answer the question like that. What all that we can come to is that the Luke Acts that we have is, basically all fiction in regards to the Christian elements of it.
Sources, Gospels. You just mentioned Josephus. I'm glad you did. Steve Mason, I'm fully convinced I'm on board with. Yeah. But you've made in comment in a previous lecture you gave that there probably were other sources, historical sources, that were helping with the Aeolian Islands and understanding the region.
Yes, so the Aegean Sea. So the Aegean Sea was recognized as a region, and we know there were historians who wrote histories about it because we have mentions of there being histories of the Aegean region. The mentions are usually of earlier histories, but there certainly would have been later histories. We don't have any of them. We don't have the names of them, but there had to have been. That wouldn't have been a neglected region. So in any library, they would have been the equivalent of Josephus, but for the Aegean, right? And that would cover all the other cities that are covered in Acts when Paul is going around the Greek islands and things like that. So, and there are a lot of these sea narratives. So they weren't just sea narratives. They were actual travel guides. They were more like travel, like tourist books, right? Like, so like half true, half false. Like there's a lot of myths and legends in them, but also like the cities mentioned and the distances to travel to get them were all real, right? So they were actual travel guides like that you could get. And there are tons of these. They're super popular, these travel guides, lots of them. We don't have hardly any of them. We have like pieces of a few, but we here have references to a ton of them. So that's an example of something that you could use. Like he could find like a good periplus, which is what we call these travel narratives, and it would have all the like basic data that he would need to build a story about Antioch,
right,
or Corinth, or Malta, right? Like he do all of these things, doing that kind of using these kinds of reference books. So just because we don't have the reference books, we can't confirm this.
Yeah.
But it's a plausible, like we know he's doing it with Josephus because we have Josephus. So it makes sense that he would do it for everything else. There's no reason why he would only crib Josephus for color detail and not crib any of the other reference books that he would have available for color detail everywhere else. So yeah, I think there's more literary references that we can't reconstruct that he had to have been relying on. But there's something, I thought you were going to go in a different direction. There's something more substantial than that, is that I even argue on the Historicity of Jesus that there probably were Christian sources that he was using, like real Christian sources. He's completely altering them in the same way he does the letters of Paul. So Paul is also one of his sources.
I was just about to.
But he deliberately rewrites, he completely contradicts Paul in numerous fundamental ways, specifically because Luke has an agenda. He wants to sell a particular version of history. It's a false version of history, but he wants to sell it. So he rewrites everything, pretends it didn't happen according to the way Paul said it happened. But he's using Paul's letters as details for how to rewrite things. And we can find this because there's so many instances where he directly contradicts Paul. The probability of that without him knowing that he's contradicting Paul, like deliberately, is very low. So we know he's using the letters of Paul. There's more evidence that he's using the letters of Paul. Scholars have written on this. There's lots of literature on it. But so that's another source. But I think there probably had to be something else. Like I suggest maybe like the narratives of Paul's trial speeches, because they're so weird. Paul's trial speeches are different from his public speeches in Acts. And they're different in ways that are consistent across the trials, but not across anything else in the book of Acts, which suggests to me that there's some sort of source that Luke is using that's lost. Now, we don't know how much of what he's giving us comes from that source, but the fact that it disagrees with Luke's own agendas, the things he puts in there, and disagrees in other ways, suggests that he's got a source that we don't have and that we can't reconstruct. But I can only say this as a suspicion, right? I can't say, oh, we know what that source said, like I can't really do it. We can, give some suspicions and some arguments, but it's not that decisive. But I do think there's a lot of ways that Acts makes no sense in the context of the gospel that Luke had just written. And in a way that suggests that Luke is reworking a version of the story that lacked all that information. And occasionally he throws in his gospel material, but he doesn't do it consistently. And because he's bad at it, he doesn't realize that he's making huge narrative mistakes. So one of the examples is like, he goes from the gospel directly into book of Acts where there's a missing body, right? And, even Matthew has the sense to think like, shit, they're going to think someone stole it, right? Luke gets rid of that storyline, but still you've got a missing body, right? Like that's a big deal. The legal authorities would be all over that, right? They'd be hauling people in, interrogating them, trying to figure out what happened to the body. Did you guys steal it? Did he escape his execution and you're still taking orders from him? Like this would be a huge scandal that the Roman forces and the Jews would be super interested in. But in the book of Acts, it's like, nah, never happened. There's no missing body. There's nothing to be worried about. And every time you have Paul interact with the authorities, it's like, I don't know, maybe he's just seeing a vision of an angel or something, right? Like there's no reference to what about the missing body? Like, did they steal it? Like where is the body? The Christians never use it as an argument. and the Jews and Romans never use it as a reason to do an inquest. Like, it just never comes up. So I think there has to be some sort of underlying Christian story that the author of Acts borrowed, in which there is no empty tomb. And it has the narrative structure, the skeleton that Luke is using. But Luke didn't like notice this glaring narrative disconnect between his two things. He just reworked the story the way he wanted it to sell the particular message he had. But it didn't occur to him, oh shit, I better like have the Romans suddenly notice that there's an empty tomb. Oh, I better have the Christians constantly referring to the empty tomb as the best evidence for their position. Oh, I should be doing, like, it never occurs to him to do this, right? And that's weird. Like, I think if Luke was writing Luke Acts just himself, just from the table, I think Acts would continue the narrative setup of the gospel. Like, it would bleed into the second novel, and there would be narrative consistency. The narrative inconsistency is weird, and I think the best way to explain it is that there was some underlying text. It's not an underlying text that said the things that modern Christian apologists want it to have said, but I think there has to have been something. And like I said, I can't prove this, and I don't claim to have proved it. I just think there's telltale signs there. And there are other things missing that do this too. Like, Jesus's family completely vanishes. Joseph of Arimathea completely vanishes. All of these characters who are crucial at the end of one novel or one chapter just disappear in the next chapter. Like, if this was a novel, you'd say, like, this is a bad writer. Like, why did he forget all these characters that he just introduced? And anyway, so that's the kind of thing that there's a lot of aspects to Acts that I think there might be some Christian source back there, but I don't think we can reconstruct it. We can make hypotheses about it based on the evidence we have, but that's not a proof. And there might be other sources that we can't reconstruct at all because we don't know what books Luke was using to build his narrative.
Okay, genre, right? So we've tackled several things so far as we've come along before we get to Q&A, and that is what is this book? You've mentioned novels. Can you give us any evidences we find in Acts or Luke and Acts that point to other genre type qualities that make you say, we're not dealing with a factual historical thing? You might have a preface that makes a weak attempt at trying to do that. And I love what Dennis McDonald said once. He was speaking at a conference, and Dennis says, you guys, some like scholarly conference too, because they'll like interrupt after a speech and jab in. And Dennis
I've been to many. I know, they're like,
Dennis just like jabs in and goes, so you're telling me this guy who's writing a historical preface 11 verses into the first chapter has angels flying around and appearing, and you're going to tell me you think that like is a historical, like that's how a historian would write something?
Right.
And I thought, whoa, that's actually quite clever to point it out. But what are some telltale signs this is a novel in the fictional category of genre?
I'll set aside all the evidence, all that's relevant is all the evidence that Luke is inventing for propagandistic purposes. So all the ways he contradicts Paul, and contradicts Paul in exactly the way that aligns with Luke's agenda, is an example of fictionalization. Now you could say that that's historical revisionism. It's still fiction in the sense that it's false, but it's not fiction in the sense of like adventure fiction, right? But that's still a big piece of it. Like, we have a lot of evidence that Luke is pushing an agenda and rewrites history to push that agenda. But apart from all that, it's just the way he writes and tells stories. And there's countless examples, and it's really that when you stack the examples that it becomes clear, right? There's the overall picture, which is that Luke looks like these religious adventure novels. There were these romances written around the same time. They were very popular. There are many more than we have, right? We only have whole or pieces of some of them, but there are a lot more of them, of these religious novels. And they had a lot of similar features. I wanted to pull it out. Maybe I'll pull out.
Go ahead.
On the Historicity of Jesus.
Hit that like button, peoples. Hey, we got 518 people watching. Check out Dr. Carrier's course and check the links. We're diving deep today.
Yeah, so in chapter 9 of this, I go into an example.
Which book is this?
On the Historicity of Jesus. Okay. And this isn't me. This is other scholars have pointed this out, Purvo among them. Here we go. So, and this is a numbered list, and it's in the chapter, so for people who are interested. So this is what all these adventure novels of this time, they have all of these features. And listen to this list of features. They all promote a particular god or religion. They are all travel narratives. They all involve miraculous or amazing events. They all include encounters with fabulous or exotic peoples. Let's see, exotic peoples. So, for example, the bull sacrificing pagans of Lycaonia in Acts 14, the superstitious natives of Malta, the philosophical Athenian dilettantes, fanatical pagan silversmiths of Ephesus. Like Acts has all of these things, just like the adventure novels, right? They often incorporate a theme of chaste couples separated and then reunited. A token nod to this element exists in Paul's chaste interaction with Lydia in Acts 16, and his many women followers, named and unnamed. They feature exciting narratives of captivities and escapes. There's several of those, weirdly several of those in the book of Acts. They often include themes of persecution, scenes involving excited crowds who become a character in the story, which happens a lot in the book of Acts, and divine rescues from danger, many times in the book of Acts. And divine revelations are always integral to the plot through oracles, dreams, and visions, all of which feature in Acts. And so that's one reason why Acts looks far more like a novel than any historical monograph, because you won't find any history that looks like that. And I do know there's like pushback on some of these things. People say, wow, you'll occasionally find something mythical and ridiculous in Josephus. And I think it's important to emphasize that, yeah, any author will throw the occasional thing in.
Right.
But what makes myth different from history is that this is a pervasive fundamental feature of the story, right? Like, so it's not like occasionally there's some incidental weird thing. It's not like Arian where, well, there was this magical snake and this other guy didn't believe it, right? Like that doesn't happen. Like, it's not just some one-off thing that happens, occasionally. No, it's fundamental to the story. Every chapter, every story is fundamentally these things.
Kind of like if I were to use an example of, and I'm getting into the propagandistic side of Acts.
Yeah.
Every time the Christians are SOL, you know what I mean? They're out of luck.
Yeah.
The Romans come in, you guilty. The Jews pointed it out. And wouldn't you know, every time in this entire series we call Acts, they're found innocent.
Yeah, it's not the Romans that do that. It's the Jews always, right? This is an important point, is that, always the Romans are like, I don't understand. What's wrong with you Jews? The Christians seem fine, right? Like all the time.
I mean, but at first they like almost think that, Paul's guilty, and then they find out, oh, hold on, what were we doing?
Well, yeah, because they're listening. Right, the Jews will make an accusation and go, that's a serious accusation. And then they'll have Paul come in and he'll give this one speech. There'll be no like prosecution, redirect or anything. Paul just gets to make his speech, and they're like, oh, wow, yeah, I don't see anything wrong with this guy. I don't get it. Like, why should we, we would let him go if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. That's the final trial line of the thing. It's like, I mean, that's wildly implausible. It's just one of many things that are wild implausibilities. But another example of implausibilities are the parallels. So there'll be parallels set up between like Paul and Jesus. So their stories actually follow a lot of similar patterns, way beyond like historical coincidence could explain. And then Paul and Peter. So Acts has Peter and Paul as major characters. They both do a bunch of the same things. Like each one of them battles one sorcerer. Each one of them escapes from prison, right? So like they're each thing that Peter does, Paul does, and Paul does them all better. So he does it better even than Jesus. Like whatever Paul does, it's bigger than Jesus. Like he covers more ground, preaches to more people, or whatever, right? And where Jesus is killed, Jesus killed and then leaves, right? He resurrects and flies off. He doesn't appear to anyone. Paul, when he dies and comes back to life, he stomps right back into town and preaches to the public, right? He's still trying to, convert heretics and whatnot. So that's even better than what Jesus did, right? So it's that kind of thing. When you look at this, you're like, come on, like, why would you believe any of this?
Yeah.
It looks like novel, right? And there's things down to like the minutest, like language, Ananias. So, Paul has the vision and it blinds him. He has to go to Ananias and get back.
I love this section. Yes. And
people don't realize that Ananias is John, the same name, John, just spelled backwards. Like it's the two words are flipped. The two root words are flipped. So Jesus gets baptized by John, which is, I can't remember that's Yahweh is gracious, I think. So one is Yahweh is gracious and the other is gracious as Yahweh. So you have John means one and Ananias means the other, but they mean the same thing, right? So Paul also gets baptized by a John, right? Except it's Ananias. It's hidden in the Aramaic. You'd have to know that the pun that is in there. And there's tons of other like parallels in that story where the version of Jesus is exactly reversed for Paul, like the sequence of events. And so it's highly improbable. And then all of this, of course, contradicts Paul's account of all of this in Galatians 1. So it's when we add all these things up, we see historicizing, we see linguistic borrowing from Homer and Virgil, we see thematic borrowing from Homer and Virgil. There are some stories that are almost like right down to like 10 different parallels in order, where the same story in the Odyssey is being retold for Paul. So we have examples of that. They're beyond the ability to deny is happening, right? And history can't have happened that way. Like you could give a rationalizing, plausible account of a historical sequence of events that would do that. But the probability that history actually turned out that way, as opposed to, Luke just saying, hey, I'm going to take the Elpenor story and turn it into an Eutychus story and just makes it up, right? He just makes it up. But he's just emulating the Odyssey. And this is another thing that people often neglect when they're trying to debate or criticize Dennis MacDonald, is they'll say, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would someone do that? It's like, that's literally what everyone was taught to do in school. So, and that's the thing, is like, we have tons of examples, like literally explicitly, this is what they were taught to do. So you're then thinking like, well, of course they're going to do it. Like anybody who writes Greek is going to do it. And so that's why you shouldn't like react to this as like, it's crazy. Right. Why would they do that? It's like, no, they're trained to do this. Like they're good at this. This is the whole point. So yeah, when you stack all the examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about, and the article people can go to and find more, and there's more in chapter 9 of my book, and there's more in the scholars I cite too, like Purvo's Hermeneia commentary is full of them. Yeah, when you go through and you stack the examples, you see like this is too pervasively fictional to be history. And then when you take that, you look at the Book of Acts, like how much of it is an adventure novel, and then look at the Annals of Tacitus, or even Xenophon's March Up Country, right? The Anabasis. You look at like, these are very different, right? Like the what they're doing is different. How they're talking about what's happening is different. How they're constructed is different. Histories look, and even then, histories look very different from novels. Acts looks exactly like a novel. It does not look like a history. And even when it's trying to pretend to look like a history, like when it throws a dateable event in, or when it is sort of semi-bogus preface and all of that stuff.
Right. Couple things that I think are important in highlighting to give you kind of a chuckle, but also you'll probably just amen it. Dennis came on. We were addressing Christian apologists who want to make the shipwreck narrative literally true, because Paul talks about being shipwrecked 3 times, and he spends like 12 words to do it.
Yeah.
And this shipwreck of one shipwreck is like ridiculously long and narrated. But what I found interesting, and Dennis pointed this out, while they wouldn't agree with his mimetic reversal of certain things and whatever, Dennis said, I dare you to go find in any of the history we have of writings of shipwrecks where a god or an angel or divine being intercedes to save them on the voyage, like you find in Homer, you also find here. You don't have it anywhere else. So
I'll correct that slightly.
Okay.
You might get mentions of the story. So there are examples in Tacitus where he will mention people telling the story of a god's intervention, but he will have authorial distance and he will be a rationalist about it. And so that sometimes Tacitus will say, well, and some people said this was the god's doing, but here's my rational explanation for what happened.
Oh, okay.
So that's that, but that's typical, right? That's how histories were written. Even if they're pushing a religious agenda, they were written that way. So the fact that Acts is 100% gullible never shows any doubt. Like, it just tells these wild stories as if no one would doubt them. That's fiction. Only fiction is like that. Like an author who's writing serious history would know that what he's saying is ridiculous or sounds ridiculous to his audience, and he would apologize for it, right? He would say, like, I know this sounds ridiculous, but here's why I believe this, or why you should believe it, or whatever. But the fact that the author like just assumes that everybody's going to just believe this wild, ridiculous stuff, that's a sign of fiction, right? That's an example, and that's what MacDonald's getting at, right? Is right. This that way of writing does not exist in history of the time. So it looks more like fan fiction you were mentioning earlier.
Right.
I was going to say the example of the Book of Enoch. Now, how many people know Christianity is founded on the Book of Enoch. Like a lot of fundamental Christian teachings from the very beginning derive from the Book of Enoch. A lot of basic assumptions, like the role of Satan and all of this stuff. A lot of what's built out of the DNA of Christianity is based on the assumption that the Book of Enoch is scripture, but it never got into scripture except for the Ethiopian canon.
Find its way in Jude.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is what is the Book of Enoch? Well, the Book of Enoch is this ridiculous story about the war in heaven, how Satan rebelled and these angels and went down and gave sorcery and taught technology and science to everybody. And this is horrible. And this is why everything went wrong in the world. And then, you know, of course, there was going to be a Messiah who will come and sort all this out and throw the demons into the hell pit or whatever. That's the Book of Enoch, right? So Christianity is built on this. But what is the Book of Enoch? So the Book of Enoch is 100% fan fiction. I mean, none of it's believable, right? Like no one went up into space and talked to angels to get like reportage of the war. Tell me about this war now. Which general did? No, that never happened, right? It's total fiction. But it's based on one sentence in Genesis. I think it's chapter 6, where it says, it just pauses in the middle of this narrative. It pauses and says, and the watchers came down from the heavens and had sex with women, and then there were giants. And then it just moves on, never touches on that. And it's very like you pause that, wait, what was this about giants?
Right.
Watchers? What are you talking about? Right? Like, so there's this one sentence and they just keep going. And so someone saw that sentence and they decided, and they wrote a whole book. Yeah, expanding that one verse into the whole freaking bogus story. And so that's what we get with Acts and that shipwreck. So Paul mentions shipwrecks. So wow, I can write a shipwreck. I mean, I was trained.
And there may have been real shipwrecks. This is this is what I said, and I don't know. I don't know if I can trust Paul completely. I'm not going to say he didn't get these three, but he flexes in that passage.
Yeah.
And it's in a passage where he needs to like have his resume look good.
Yes.
So I don't know about you.
Suffering is an important piece of the resume. This is another thing that Christian apologists forget, is that their epistemology is different from our epistemology.
Right.
We believe that evidence, and probabilities and things matter. That's how you prove something, is with evidence. That is not the epistemology of the ancient thinkers. Certainly of Paul's audience, that is not their epistemology at all. For them, they care about, like, are you sent by God? And how would you prove that you're sent? If you're sent by God, you're telling the truth. That's it. So how do we know you're sent by God? One is, I suffer for the faith. Why would I suffer the faith if it wasn't true? Wow, that's an amazing argument. You must be telling the truth about everything. Right? Yeah, no, right? But I think people forget that this is a whole epistemology, that it is a bankrupt, ineffective, unreliable epistemology. But it is a super popular epistemology that a lot of people bought, especially then, even still today, but especially back then. And there's others, like, can you do miracles? That was one. And now they still have the thing like, well, even the devil can do miracles. Even the devil's guys can do miracles. And that's when you come to the whole, like, well, are your teachings in line with moral truth? Are you teaching moral things? Which is a circular argument, right? Like, it's like, what's moral, right? That kind of thing. But none of this has anything to do with what your factual claims are true or not, right? Like, if you're saying, it's like how you test the spirits. Are they saying moral things or immoral things? And that's it. And that's your only way of deciding what is a true spirit communication and what's not. And so this is their epistemology. And I write, people are interested in this, I have a whole chapter on it in my book, The Scientist and the Early Roman Empire, where I go into the epistemology of ancient Christians and how it radically differed from the epistemology of natural philosophers of their own time. And that's the difference between religion and science then and now, ever since, right? And so if you want to understand the basis of this, that's it. But that's the whole thing, like you were saying, like, he needs to build his resume.
Right.
But he doesn't build his resume by, like, getting, sworn affidavits from witnesses or saying, like, oh, I studied under Peter for a year and memorized his story. And no, he doesn't do any of that. He says, I suffered for the faith. So I must be awesome. I must be telling the truth.
It's suffering. It's suffering.
That's right. Yeah.
Look, so our time is limited, and I gotta get through some of this stuff before we get to Q&A. I absolutely love what you're doing here. I want to read you something that I kind of did at the beginning of a video once, and it's from our favorite website, ourdailybread.org. Hallelujah. And so
I don't know this website, but go on, proceed.
So I'm going to share my screen for 1 second just to kind of tease people here so they can see what I'm doing in case you're curious. The miracles of God in Acts, right? And I scrolled down and I just wanted to go through. And so I'm going to read Sound of Rushing. This is so interesting. So when you read, if you read any other book, I'm asking for those who are, evangelical fundamentalists and such. If you were reading any other book that was saying this kind of material, I would hope, and I don't even think I would even need to make mention of this. I think you would be as cautious in approaching.
It's funny that they clearly think that this proves like the spiritual authority of Acts.
Yeah.
Like they think this is a positive thing, the huge list of miracles. Whereas any like rational observer is like, actually, you're undermining the truth of this narrative. Like, why would it have this many wild things happening in it?
Right.
That's not a plausible.
Sound of rushing wind, tongues of fire, miraculous speech, layman healed, building shaken, sudden death of Ananias and Sapphira, imprisoned apostles freed by angel, Philip transported from desert to Azotus, light and voice at Saul's conversion, Saul blinded and healed, Aeneas healed of paralysis. Dorcas restored to life, Herod's violent death, Elymas and the sorcerer blinded, cripple at Lystra healed, demons cast out of slave girl, Paul freed from prison by earthquake, Eutychus raised from the dead, Paul unaffected by viper's bite, father of Publius healed, clusters of miracles, many wonders and signs, many signs and wonders. The shadow of Peter apparently healed some, and a multitude gathered, and they were all healed. Stephen did great wonders and signs. The multitudes heeded, hearing and seeing the miracles which Philip did. The Lord granted signs. Anyway, here's where it gets interesting. A wrong assumption about miracles. Now, look, the Christian website wanted you to know, hallelujah. then they go on to go, all right, now, the fact that many miracles occur does not mean that every believer should always expect one whenever he faces a problem. They're already trying to talk you off the ledge of a miracle happening in your own life.
And that list omits all the visions and dreams, right? So that's another set of miracles. So well put. I think that is a good example of how they're living in a different epistemology than we are. Like for us, that's evidence against Acts being a history.
And if they read about the giant cross coming out of the tomb, or the bed bugs, marching like military ants and stuff. I mean, they would read that and go, how ridiculous, because they've been trained, kind of told what is canon, what is the measure of what is the correct books that we can read. But if they didn't have that kind of boundary, the question is, would they look at that and go, yeah, bedbugs actually did, he had the powers and the magic to turn the birds.
If it was in the canon, you bet they would totally be defending bedbug marching orders. Yeah, I agree. The thing is that's the Acts of John for people who are interested. But in the Acts of John, and I brought this up to a Christian apologist in an event recently, and I wrote about it on my blog briefly. But so I asked him, like, well, okay, look, here's the Acts of John. It not only relates this event, but it names the witnesses. Like, here's this huge list of people who were there and saw it. It gives their names, says their families were there, all of this stuff. And I'm like, so should we believe that? And if you say that we should doubt a list of names, like they're actually trying to say that we have witnesses to this. No, they made that up, right? Like he even said, like, yeah, okay, they probably made that up, but that document is late, right? It's actually not significantly later than the Book of Acts, our Book of Acts, right? So, so that argument is bad unless what you do as Christian apologists, they need to front date these texts. They need Acts to be before 60 AD or whatever, or before 70, because once you accept that it's early 2nd century, well, now it looks just like the Acts of John, and the Acts of John claims to have better witness testimony and evidence of the sources than our Book of Acts does. Right. So, it's like, is your epistemology just that what you need someone to do is lie more? Like the bigger lie will convince you. And it's like, does lying more make your testimony more probable to be true? No, it's the other way around, right? So it's the backwards epistemology. Our epistemology, as we look at this and we go, yeah, that looks like a novel. That doesn't look like history at all. their epistemology is, well, hallelujah, look at all the miracles, it must be from God, right? But of course they have to like tack onto that, oh, but it's canonical, oh, it has to be early, all of this stuff, so they can make that work, essentially.
So we've tackled genre, we've tackled sources, we've tackled interesting, funny stuff. One more thing I'd like to mention, and we won't have too much time. I think after this we should get to Q&A, and that is literary imitation. Fun stuff we find within Acts that go, what? Like something sounds like Dionysus, Euripides Bacchae, the imprisoning, being freed from prison, the earthquake. That's found in Euripides 500 years, maybe 600 if this is early 2nd century, and this is 600 years earlier. We have Dionysus, a god who is a demigod, who's birthed by Zeus and his mother Semele, that already had a prison break. And so I'm looking at stuff like that. But the one that I wanted to highlight that I don't know if you have heard yet, by Michael Kolshinosh, which was a student of Dennis MacDonald. We did an episode called Better Call Paul Saul, kind of riffing off the show.
Yeah, tell this story. Right. I know of it, but go. Yeah.
I love this. So the name of Paul in all of his letters is Paul. And scholars for centuries have argued, is Saul Paul? And what is this? His Roman name, and one's a Jewish name. And there's all this debate for centuries. Yeah. He comes in, cuts through the fluff, and says, listen, all you have to do is recognize that after chapter 9, this guy is now called Paul. He was called Saul, and the peak of Saul's narrative with the transition where he converts or turns is when he is knocked down, or he's on the road to Damascus, bright light, and then all of a sudden this voice says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? That exact phrase is in 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel, one of the Chronicles, Samuel, King's books, I can't remember, but it's King David who literally could have killed King Saul, cut off a piece of his clothes, even felt guilty about that because it's the Lord's anointed. And he cries out to Saul from the hill and says, Saul, Saul, why do you pursue me? And so in the Greek, from what I understand in the LXX, is that it's the same Greek word for pursue and persecute.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so here you have a literary imitation, like an invented narrative, where you have the apostle Paul, who was called Saul. Literally, Jesus is the King David saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And I won't get into the whole comparison to the minor
for the benefit of the audience, and also I might do a blog on this. I have heard it before, but I want to go look into it again. Author, what is his name? How do you spell it?
Michael Kolshinosh. I think it's Kochhenash, something like this.
Okay, I'll look for it. I'm sure I've heard it somewhere. I didn't read the original study though, but I want to look at it because I want to add that to the list of things that are relevant. Because then there's more. There's more in the literature than even you and I have talked about. Even more than I list in chapter 9. One can go through. I bet there's more even than Purvo mentions in the Hermeneia commentary, especially since that's now 20 years out of date, exactly. Right? And you can't trust Christian apologists to include data like that. So their version of Acts commentaries are not as useful in that regard. But yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's lots of examples like that. And when you stack the number of them, when you go to chapter 9 on the historicity of Jesus, and you just look through there and you stack them all, and you're like, okay, look, at some point you have to admit that this is the fundamental nature of this literature. This is not an occasional wonder they throw in. We're looking at fiction. We're not looking at history. And that's especially even in the important sense, where it is rewriting history. If you look at the letters of Paul, what Paul talks about was going on in the church and what his narrative was and his chronology. Acts completely subverts all of that. So even in regards to the sources, the historical sources it did have for the origins of Christianity, we know the author of Acts has no interest in what actually happened. He has an opposite interest to conceal what happened, to make up completely different things, even opposite things as having happened.
So Dr. Carrier,
rewriting history. So that's I think is probably the most important takeaway. It's not just fiction.
On that point, I have to ask you to answer this question. Then we're going to do Q&A, literally. Mm-hmm. You brought up something I've heard Christian apologists say, okay, Dr. Carrier, here's the problem. You're claiming that Acts is using Paul's letters, but he doesn't agree with Paul. There are some scholars who will say, since Acts doesn't agree with Paul, it's clear he isn't using Paul's letters. So you're suggesting, answering that question, that rather than using Paul's letters to accurately get Paul, he has an agenda. Really, this isn't really a companion who wants to be accurate and be in agreement with
exactly
Paul,
right.
with Paul. He has an overwhelming agenda that outweighs the evidence found in Paul's letters for his own purposes.
Yeah, and I'd say there's two things to note when Christians say that kind of argument. First is that we have a lot more evidence for the use than that. So there is linguistic evidence and things like that. So in my article on Mark's use of Paul's epistles, which you can find on my blog at richardcarrier.info, I list some of the scholarship on that argument that Mark used Paul's epistles. Some of those sources are for all the Gospels. So some of those scholars talk about Luke's use of Paul's epistles as well. And those scholars will go into all the evidence. And there's a variety of converging evidence. It's not just this one thing that I mentioned. So the case is stronger than the Christian apologist is making out. The other argument is that it's highly unlikely, just as a matter of coincidence, that Luke would exactly contradict Paul in so many specific ways that just happen to align with his agenda. And particularly when you compare with the Galatians narrative, the probability that Luke doesn't know the Galatians narrative and just somehow miraculously picked every detail he wants to change in the Galatians and changed it is highly unlikely unless he knows Galatians and is deliberately retelling the story. And I would make the same argument, by the way, for the nativities. I think that's one of the reasons why usually people say Luke can't have known Matthew's nativity because it's so different. And there have been several scholars who pointed out that the argument is the other way around, that in fact, Luke reverses things in Matthew that require him to know that they were in Matthew. So he deliberately rewrites the story in Matthew.
And there's
and it's in line with Luke's
not
agenda.
Aware, right?
Right. And it's in line, right, exactly. It's in line with Luke's agenda. And so if you were to predict, say, okay, Luke has this agenda, he has Matthew, what would he do to the story? You could predict every change Luke makes, not in the particulars, but in the general aspects of it. And one of the big ones is the how Luke converts the outlaw family. They break all the laws. They run away from the law, Herod, run away to Egypt, can't do the pilgrimages. They can't be good Jews and do the pilgrimages because they're hiding. They're outlaws, literally. Luke completely reverses that and weirdly, conspicuously reverses it. He has them deliberately stick around to obey the law, like the law of Caesar, and has them go to Jerusalem every year, like to do the pilgrimages. So like he makes this, like, it completely contradicts Matthew on purpose because he wants Jesus's family to be law abiding. He wants to prove how law abiding Christians are. And that's his theme throughout the gospel and Acts, is that Christians are law abiding. It's those dirty little Jews that are being mean and not letting us do our thing. It's Christians are law-abiding citizens, right? That's the whole idea of Luke, and that's one of his agendas. And you can explain almost everything Luke does using that among other aspects of his agenda. But that's one of his main agendas. But so even what he did with Matthew's nativity shows this. And I think when you look at the way he used Paul's epistles is another example showing this. Luke wants a certain narrative, and he has to paint it a certain way. And one of the other aspects of Luke's agenda is that he wants to argue that the church was always unified. There was never any disharmony. It's always the Jewish outsiders who are the enemy. It was never internal debates and combats. And so that's why he has Peter get a vision from God about the Gentile mission before Paul. Right. Like it's very clear from Paul's narrative that no one had ever heard of this idea until Paul did. And he was like really had to struggle to get it accepted by Peter. There's no mention in, Galatians of Peter saying, oh, you know what? Yeah, I had a vision of that before you even came along. No, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of like the Torah observant Christians and the sort of Christians under Paul, that when he's converting Gentiles he's converting them without converting them to Judaism. That created a lot of tension. There were Christians who did not agree with that. And Paul talks about that. There's a lot of pressure and issues, and it was difficulty in wrangling. Luke papers that all over. He says, no. We were always unified. This message was given to Peter, the founder of the church, from the beginning, etc. And so it's just the outsiders that are a problem. And that whole narrative, that's an example. You can see the narrative of Acts as pushing that storyline. And so that it creates a unity to all the ways he changes Paul's narrative. He changes it in all the ways that he wants to change it to serve his agenda. And there are other aspects of Luke's agenda I could go into, but that's just an example of what's going on.
Wow, there's so much here. 670 people watching. Hit the like button. Check out Dr. Carrier's website. Are you ready for Q&A?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's do this thing. Mohammed, thank you for becoming a YouTube member. I plan on having more content put up. Actually, I've got several interviews too. We've got a lot. All right. Rochelle Goad, thank you so much. Or Rachel Goad. A tangential question for Dr. Carrier. Feel free to come back to it. You describe yourself as something of a cinephile. What film have you watched most repeatedly? What makes it repetition worthy?
Oh, most repeatedly. Oh my God. Movie? I don't know. I go on bouts. Okay. So the answer is going to be not impressive. So let me think of like, what is the movie I've seen the most times? Rather than, because I'll watch a movie over and over and again over time. And I have a whole list, and I wouldn't say there's many that I do the most. But there is one movie that I've watched way more than I ought to have done, is National Treasure, the Nicolas Cage movie. It's a ridiculous movie in every conceivable way, but it is fun. It is a well-constructed film. It actually is good at what it's supposed to be doing, which is a cheesy, hyper rah adventure drama. And it's good at it. And so I will actually enjoy rewatching that movie, even though it's not great cinema in the usual auteur sense.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I wouldn't say that like, there's probably other movies I've watched more, but The Thing, for example, is probably the most watched of horror. That is the movie I've rewatched the most of any horror genre, is John Carpenter's The Thing, for example. So there are others I could answer, but there you go.
Thank you so much for that super chat. Q source is in the house. I am unnecessary. Just what Luke kept from Matthew.
What does that mean? Oh, Q.
Yeah, Q source is the name. You don't think Q source is necessary. Not saying there aren't sources possibly.
Yeah. No, I don't think we can establish that. I don't think we can establish there weren't either. So that's the point you were making. I agree. But we can't establish that there were, and we certainly can't reconstruct what they said. And that's, I think is the main thing. I suspect there aren't. I'm with Robin Faith Walsh. I think it's all de novo. I think they're just making it up. I don't think they have sources, except for Acts. Like I said, I think there's indications of source material there. But for the Gospels, I don't. I think Mark made it up. He just reified the teachings of Paul by telling a story involving Jesus. He wrote his Harry Potter novel, and then everybody redacted that, like retold the story, changing it the ways they wanted, adding the things they wanted, subtracting the things they wanted. I don't think there are sources for this stuff. I think it's all Mark. It all goes back to Mark. None of this stuff existed before Mark, and I think that's my take on it. I don't rely on that. In other arguments I make, I don't require that to be the case. It's just, if you ask me what I think is the case, that's what I think is the case.
Got it. Okay. Sages and Pages, thank you for the super chat. Do you agree with Steve Mason's dating of Luke Acts to the 2nd century CE? If yes, why didn't the author include Paul's death in the narrative?
Yeah, I do. And Mason's not alone. There's I think it's kind of the mainstream consensus now. Like, so we're talking Pervo, the Westar Institute scholars. Like, there's a whole bunch of us now. It's kind of like we're settled on this. It's early 2nd century. There's not really a good case for anything earlier. As to that particular thing, it actually does mention the death of Paul. It has Paul refer to his own death earlier on. He gives a speech where he shows that he's aware that he's going to die, which means the author knows that he dies. So that means the author excluded that story for some other reason. And there's a variety of possible explanations. I mean, the author himself doesn't tell us, so we don't know. But there's a variety of explanations. I mean, the simplest one is that he just died. The author died before finishing the novel. That happens, right? But a more plausible explanation, or I think more probable explanation, is that would have ruined his narrative. So remember all the things I just talked about, his agenda. His agenda requires the Romans are always good to us. We're always law abiding. That destroys, he can't tell any narrative where the Romans kill Paul. He can't. right? So he has to just sort of like push that under the rug and pretend it didn't happen. Yeah.
Yes,
So he has a triumphal narrative where Paul was preaching the gospel. And there's another possibility is that he didn't know. And I think there's a lot of evidence that the idea that Paul died in Rome is a late legend. The earliest author who actually knew Paul is the author of First Clement. And he says that Paul died in Spain, which is the furthest west. He says the farthest point of the west, which was a phrase for Cadiz or referencing Spain. So there was no notion of Paul dying in Rome until later. So when the author of Luke Acts wrote, which is early second century, those legends of Paul being killed in Rome might not have existed yet. The author of Acts might not have known the circumstances. In fact, no one might have known the circumstances of Paul's death. They might have just gotten a report, well, he's dead, and there are no surviving witnesses or whatever to like relate. Like we don't have any stories that tell us what really happened. And it's possible they didn't have any stories that tell them what happened. So I guess he left it off because he didn't know the story. He knew Paul went off to Spain and never came back. It's like that's all he knew. But it's also possible he knew how Paul was killed, and he very specifically could not tell that story because it would contradict his agenda.
The real kicker is just that earlier you're saying he kind of points to his own death, and that's the kicker, I think.
Yeah, it means that the author did know that he's not around. Now that could be like if he's writing in the early second century, the author knows he's dead, right? Like there's no way he's still alive. He couldn't be a 140-year-old man running around. Right. So he knows he's dead. So he might just assume he's dead because, physics. But it's also possible he did know that he had died. And it's just a story that it was so contradict Luke's agenda, he can't tell it. And that's why he left it off.
Thank you so much. Doc Pleuromenot in the house. How does Luke's Egyptian, notice you point this out in your lectures as well in your writings, leading Sicarii into the desert make any sense when their narrative is solely derived from concealing daggers in urban settings? Is he just keeping and using Josephus's Latin vocabulary innovation?
Good catch. I do talk about this. It's my favorite example, and it's probably the most important example of how Luke screws up the use of his source. And this is one of the examples. There's a better one where he gets the date of Theudas wrong. He has Gamaliel talking about Theudas, even though Theudas, his story, his rebellion happened like a decade after Gamaliel. So like he's somehow Gamaliel knows the future and all his audience knew the future. No, I know. Josephus tells the story of these guys in a particular order, but he tells one of them in flashback. So the physical sequence in which Josephus tells them, Luke mistakes for chronological sequence, and consequently he fucks up the order of these rebels, and he only names the rebels that Josephus does. So all of this combined, the probability of that is very, very low unless Luke is using Josephus and just didn't pay close attention to what Josephus was saying. Didn't realize it was flashback. And the same thing with the Egyptian. So Josephus mentions the Egyptian and the Sicarii around the same place. But if you're reading closely, you'll notice that Josephus says they're different. They're completely different people. They're not related in any way whatsoever. So for the author of Acts to confuse them as related to each other is an example of how he's using sources, but he's not good at it. Like he's being very sloppy. But the mistake makes no sense unless he's using Josephus. Like why else would he put Sicarii in the same place as the Egyptian? I mean, Josephus puts them in the same place in the story, but he doesn't link them causally. Right. But yeah, if you're just skimming Josephus for data, if you're just using, going your reference works, you're just really quickly, you've looking through Wikipedia and not reading it carefully. This is what happens, right? Is like you make a mistake like this, but the mistake can only be explained by your doing that. I think this is one of those examples that shows that Luke is using Josephus.
Look at the Sicarii, right? Like I love what's said here by Doc, and that is they were dagger wielding, like they were up close terrorists. Yeah. They only wanted to sneak up amongst the huge crowd of people, shank you and dip. Yeah. You're not going to go out in the wilderness, like in this open area.
No, absolutely not. And the Egyptian wasn't doing that anyway. Like he has no connection to the Sicarii. Right. But you're right. Yeah, the Sicarii, even in concept, only makes sense in urban environments. And the Egyptian as described, only makes sense in a rural environment because that was his thing. Like so, exactly. It's an error that is obviously a historical error. So Axe is unreliable in that regard, but it's also just an error in the use of his own source.
Thank you so much. Marabara, thank you for the super chat. Could it be that Q source are sayings of another or several apocalyptic preachers? In my opinion, Matthew did it to make Jesus look more historical.
Possible, yeah. I think certainly we have proof of concept. So we know a lot of things that other people said get put into the mouth of Jesus, canonically and non-canonically. So that's a thing people did. We know that. And it's also possible. So to give you an example, on the historicity of Jesus, I go into the argument that the Sermon on the Mount, and there's scholarship, and I cite scholars talking about it. Scholarship shows that the Sermon on the Mount was written after the Jewish War, so it was written in Greek, so it does not go back to Jesus. And this is another Westart Institute agrees. Like little pieces of it might go back to Jesus, but the sermon itself is a fabrication after the war. And there's certain reasons we can show that whoever wrote it is writing for a context in which the Jewish temple doesn't exist anymore. And there's ways you can show that. And I talk about that in my book. But so someone wrote that. It's also a very coherent, so literarily coherent speech. It's a very elegantly constructed speech, which is exactly the kind of thing that can only be written. It can't be, this is not like what you would see in oral transmission at all. It is definitely someone sat down, carefully composed this very careful speech and wrote it for a Greek milieu outside after the Jewish war had already transpired. So you can show that. Now, does that mean Matthew did it? It doesn't mean someone wrote it after the Jewish war, but it could have been some Christian prophet, some Christian missionary. This might have been like a speech or a letter that someone had. It could have been a letter of Peter's, for all we know, right? Like the real Peter. I mean, for all we know, like we don't know, or Peter's son, or who knows. And so it could have come from someone, and then someone just said, "I'm just going to lift this and put it in and give it and put it in the mouth of Jesus." It's totally possible. It would make sense in the way things were done back then. I'm inclined to suspect not. I think Matthew is constructing all this stuff himself. But I can't prove that, and I think like the hypothesis being proposed here is plausible. So I can't rule it out. I just suspect it's all Matthew. I think he's doing it all himself.
Thank you. Doc Pluralmanot's back again. Is Philip asking the Ethiopian if he understands Isaiah a transposed inversion of Josephus's account of Eleazar asking Izates if he understands Genesis and ritual circumcision, raw material for the Agabus prophecy aside? So I'm going to let you answer that, and I'll be right back.
Oh, well, no, that's terrible because I don't have an answer.
You don't have an answer?
No, I haven't looked into this enough to really say. I've heard of this. I've heard people suggest it. I've not dived into I've not checked. Has this been covered in the peer-reviewed literature, for example?
Right.
Has anybody talked about it? I haven't checked. Are there parallels in the language? I haven't checked. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's possible though. I think it's entirely plausible, and it is the kind of thing he would do. But this particular example, I haven't looked into.
Thank you, Doc. I'm sorry we couldn't answer it better.
Yeah.
Sargento, new to your channel. I'm enjoying everything, even the cringe. Stay up. Well, thank you for tolerating the cringe and everything else, my friend. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you for the support. Exit Music. Has Dr. Carrier read Bruce Lincoln's theorizing myth, large part of the basis for Robin Faith Walsh's book on the Gospels, and any opinions on his thesis?
No, I haven't read it. I only know it through Walsh's use of it. So, and for people who want to know my opinion of Walsh's thesis, I have a whole article on that on my blog. I'm mostly positive. I think she's right by and large. But specifically Lincoln's theory, I don't know. I can't weigh in on that.
Thank you so much, X Music. I thank you for that. John D, when you say Axe is a novel, would it have been read as such at the time? Wouldn't it need to be thought historical to be effective? I'm gonna let you answer this.
I don't know, but also it can do both. Their origin. Where do I talk about this? I think I do discuss it in On the Historicity of Jesus. It's in, I think, chapter 4, where I go into how Origen talks about how the Gospels were written for two audiences. And for the elite audience, educated audience, it was written in allegorical form. So you're supposed to understand the hidden truths behind the text. But for the masses who are illiterate, it was meant to be taken literally because they won't believe or understand the allegory. So they have to be converted on the literal meaning. And then when they die and go to heaven, then we can sort them out. But there's not enough time to teach them all the education they need to grasp the allegorical meaning. So we'll sell it on the literal just to get them in the door. And then when they die and they're in heaven, we can teach them everything. And he literally does talk about this, like how in heaven we'll sort them out. Is the idea. And this is called the doctrine of double truth. There's been scholarship on this. There's other authors who hint at it. So it could be both, right? So you could have the author knows that illiterate people who hear this story written or spoken, right? So people would read it out in congregations, will just believe it literally, and it will have the effect on them that they want. But for the audience who are sophisticated, they don't need to take it literally. They can understand it all as the messaging, right? And that's fine, because that's the class divide, the education divide. That's the way ancient literature could roll. So it's different from now. Like we wouldn't normally try to do that. Well, one could say the neocons kind of do that, but that's the idea, right? Is that so it doesn't have to be an either or question. What I do think, though, is I think Luke does want this primarily to be taken as history because he needs the propaganda effect of it being historical. So he wants this to be the story. He wants this to be the narrative. That he chooses to use the novelistic format, I think, is another example of how he's using. It's kind of like if we look at a historian. I don't know, David Irving or some like Holocaust denier or whatever, like these historians who want to rewrite history.
Right.
Then they write like this novel, like Dan Brown, right? Let's take Dan Brown's novel. I'm not that I'm calling him a Nazi, complete different analogy. So Dan Brown wrote fiction, but a lot of people took it as like fundamentally true, right? Like not that the characters were real or the things happened, but the whole backstory, like the mystery that was revealed, etc., as true, right? And a lot of Christian apologists had a problem with this, so they're like attacking Dan Brown's book. They're attacking fiction for being factually wrong, right? Which sounds ridiculous, right? Until you realize that they are taking it seriously as if it was a history book, right? And I think if you think of the mindset and the blurring of genres in the ancient world, that makes sense for Luke. Like he wants a popular, engaging narrative. He picks the narratives that are popular and engaging, which is the novelistic format. One thing that would make this make more sense is that they didn't have genre categories. Like there's no such thing as the word the novel, right? Like no one talked about genres back then the way they do now. Like now we have different book areas where fiction goes over here and science goes over here. That isn't how books were organized back then. They didn't talk about genre that way. So the idea of a novel and a history looking different makes sense to us in hindsight, looking at how these things get approached and constructed and built. But it made less sense back then because books are books, right? A story is a story. It would take a concerted rationalist to say, like, this story looks silly. Like, your historians suck. Like, the way they write history doesn't look anything like history. And they would be right, but that isn't what Luke is doing. Luke is trying to appeal to a popular audience to try and get people influenced into buying it, right? So he doesn't want to write like a fake history book with fake footnotes and stuff, right? No, he wants to write an engaging novel that tells the stories he wants to tell. But I do think he wants it to be taken literally, even though he knows it's all bullshit. And he probably knows that some other people know it's bullshit, but those people are the people who are on his side, right? Like who totally agree that that's the narrative we want to sell. And so I think
that's what's racking in the dough, right? Like
there's an aspect to that. Yeah. Power, influence, money is a factor. That is true. But I also think it has a lot to do with moral social agendas got attached to these narratives. And it's much the same way that like the King Arthur narrative, if you were to say that was a myth in early England, if you were to say that was a myth, people would take you as saying that you don't believe in a unified England, that you don't believe in a united kingdom.
Right.
Right. Like, so like, even that's not what you're saying. Like, that's what they would take you to say. And now like swords are being drawn, right? Like, this is a big deal. And I think it's the same thing. It's like, it's if you say that this is fiction, you're also saying that the narrative is like the message, the point of it, the social agenda attached to it is also wrong. And you can't have that. And so I think there's a tendency towards people to historicize, to believe more and more in the myths being historical, because they need the myths to be historical to build their morals on top of it. And I think that's a big factor of it. And this is true throughout history. I think it still happens today, but it was especially true back then. People took their myths seriously. And like the elites would be skeptical and talk about allegory and all of this stuff. But the illiterate people, the masses, hated them for this. And I talk about this in Scientists on the Early Roman Empire. In the first chapter, I give examples of where scientists are telling each other, like, don't tell the common people this, right? Don't tell them storms aren't caused by Poseidon. They'll not handle that well. Like, don't say that. Just don't say that. But in their books, they'll say it because no one reads. They can't read, so they're not going to be reading our books. That's fine. But they're not going to come to our dinner parties, so we can talk all we want in our dinner parties. But don't go out in public and tell them that, because they'll throw rocks at you. Like, this, not the thing, right? So this is the environment that they're working in, and it's important to understand that cultural context.
So they weren't mything around. Don't myth around with the myth. All right. So Dr. Carrier, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 questions.
Sweet.
I want to try and get through before we have a wrap up here. Almost 700 people watching live. Check out Dr. Carrier's works. And if you haven't, like, you're hard on trying to read paperback, they're on Audible. You can check them out and listen to them as you're mowing the grass, going for a ride. It's highly critical. It's secular critical scholarship. My favorite kind of scholarship is that, without that kind of trying to sell you, Theophilus, a package. Okay, Blake, when Ananias and Sapphira died, did God kill them? Or did they die by overwhelming guilt? Did they blaspheme the Spirit? Why did Luke include this story?
You could ask, like, what would even be recognized as the difference between these two scenarios, right? Like, if they died from overwhelming guilt, isn't that God killing them? Like that God designed the world for that to happen, and it's still God responsible, right? What does Luke want you to think? I think he doesn't care whether you think God did it. I don't think, like, these two hypotheses, he doesn't care. Pick your one. It's just fine, as long as you pick one of them, because his whole message is basically Stalinism, is you better follow this program or you're going to die. Like, whether God's doing it or not, let the theologians debate that, but you're going to die if you don't like throw your money in. Yeah, I mean, it's a coercive fascist narrative, basically. It is true. It's not just Marxism, it's Stalinism, right? Because you have people being killed for not joining the commune, right? So, like, that's why it's like one of the most shocking stories.
Wow.
But it is the message, and I don't think, like, Luke is saying we need to kill shirkers.
No, it's
I don't think I don't think that's his point. I think his point is, like, that instant karma is going to get you. I think that's his idea. The idea is to scare you with the boogeyman,
right, rather
than scare you with an actual, we're faith militant is coming for your ass. Like, I don't think that's what he's advocating. I think he's just advocating for the moral of the story is bad things might happen to you if you don't play along. And I don't think it matters to him what the theological causal mechanism is. It's irrelevant.
It's almost like, John, when I wrote my only article, because I've been so time constraint with, like, making videos, the one article I did write where I say Jesus breaks the fourth wall in the Gospel of John, where he looks at the reader and he's like, but blessed are you who don't see.
That's right.
It's like, don't be Thomas, man. Just believe,
That's really good example. No, that's perfect example of what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Right. That's kind of what this author's doing. He's winking. He's looking at you, Theophilus. He's looking at the guy he's trying to get to pay,
which means lover of God, which Theophilus just means any Christian or any target of the book. So
anyone who's going to be a devotee of the Christ movement is my point. Whether it's an individual group, I don't know.
And that's how these stories are told. I mean, I don't want to, like, drag us into digressions, but I often tell a story. That one of my girlfriends, she's ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and she tells a story like there was a story told in her congregation, and the story was basically that this young couple, like this girl is really interested in this boy, he's really interested in her, and so they go for a walk, and they get to talking about things, and eventually, like, because they're alone and they're out in the forest, and the boy says, like, they get to talking, like, we can tell each other anything, right? We can tell each other anything, yeah. And then he talks about, well, I have these doubts about the religion, etc. And then they get back, and then she rats him out. And that now there's discipline and all, things happen.
Right.
And she's like, that story never happened. But they tell the story because now everyone's fucking afraid to admit that they're a doubter, even in private to someone they trust, because now they've been told this story that they might rat you out. Right. So it doesn't matter, like, whether the story is true. It doesn't matter, like, what the causal aspects of it are. It's just meant to instill fear that you think, oh my God, that might happen to me. And now you're shut down. Now you can't talk about your doubts with people. Right. And so it's a control doctrine. And I think a lot of mythology operates that way.
Thank you so much. Constellation Pegasus. I haven't seen you in a while. Hey, hate to change the subject, but how do we know the census in Luke didn't happen according to the gospel account? Why would the writer put this in the book? Evidently false history.
It's only false in the, like, sloppy description of it, right? So like Luke is just bad at describing it. Like if you are charitable and say, like, well, okay, he's being loose in the way he's describing it, it's not completely wrong, right? Like, it's just wrong about some things. And so I think and we've already seen examples where Luke is sloppy, right? So we know he, like, is, when he, especially reading Josephus, like, he'll lift stuff from Josephus and he'll screw things up. Like, he's quick, he's rushed, he's not really paying close attention. And so the errors in his account of the census can be totally accounted for by him just being lazy. There is truth to it, right? And it's not that there was a global census that happened in 6 AD. There was just a standing census order that all the provinces be counted. But when each province was counted varied, because there are different traditions, and the clock had started at different times. And the only reason the census started in 6 AD is because that's when it was annexed to Syria. So as soon as they annexed it, they had to start a census. And so that would start the clock. And I think they were every 10 years. They had to do and I think provincial censuses were every 3 or 4 years or something. And so its clock was different than everybody else, but there was a decree of Augustus that all the world should be, all the provinces should have a census. It's just that decree was, like, decades ago and didn't apply to this specific case. It just was a general order for all the provinces. And then there's just a historical event just happened to make Judea subject to that decree finally, and so there was a census, etc. So there is a correct narrative you could write. It's just Luke is bad at telling the story, whether he knows the truth of it or not. I don't know, but he's just bad at explaining it. So there is truth to the story. It's complicated, and I do talk about this for people who are interested in the minute details of the census issue, particularly with Christian apologetics about this. My book Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which you showed earlier, has a whole chapter on the dating of the nativity, the discrepancies between Matthew and Luke, where I go through every possible Christian attempt to harmonize those two and explain with historical facts why they're wrong. And it answers your question, which is, how do we know these things about the census? We know it from, hard detective work as historians. So we have tons of references in not just literature, but papyri and inscriptions, and we have a lot of data that we can use to triangulate our knowledge of what was going on. And so we know a lot of things about the census. And so that's how we can answer all of these questions about what was really happening, how it really worked, and stuff like that. And one example people often point out is the census never required you to move. You could register where you were, like you didn't have to go anywhere. But like you could come up with a story. So let's say when Judea was annexed to Syria, Galilee was not. And so there wouldn't have been any reason for a Nazarene to be registered in the census, right? But if you said, when they said, Luke says, well, he was a tribe of Benjamin and therefore had to go to Bethlehem, and that's complete bullshit. There's no basis for that whatsoever. They would never do that. And there's no evidence that they did. But if he owned property in Bethlehem, then he might need to do it, right? But then you have the story that he has to go to the manger or whatever. So I thought he owned property. Like,
Just
so
go
like,
to
like,
your
like the story doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can invent narratives that would make it make sense. But it's just, Luke just needs a reason for people to move. And there have been historians that pointed out, like, nomads did have to go to a place. So if they weren't really Nazarenes, if they were just goat herders in the wilds, and the nearest town was Bethlehem, and so they had to register. You know, there's like stories you could tell, but we know this is all made up, right? Like, none of this happened. So what's the point in trying to work out what really happened? Nothing did. But yeah, the way we know all of this stuff is from tons and tons of data that we can piece together to build what was really happening, how censuses really worked and stuff. There's also stuff we don't know, right? So there's things that we can't see for sure.
Thank you so much. Constellation again says, you two need to get away from MythVision and get to a Kingdom Hall quick. Armageddon is right around the corner. Better get busy. Thank you so much.
Always right around the corner. 2,000 years right around the corner.
Thank you. Name Christian. In Armageddon, Bart implies that Revelation, I think they mean singular, was partly inspired by Tacitus's mention of Nero's torture of Christians. Wouldn't that constitute a source referring to the Testimonium Tacitum? Thoughts?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily. Like, if the event happened, then it could just be independent corroboration, right? Like, Tacitus writes about it decades later, but it happened, so other people are going to write about it. So that wouldn't be the issue. The issue would be if the fire didn't, if the persecution in relation to the fire didn't happen, then you have a problem explaining how that would be in Revelation, right? And this is the thing, is that I don't think the Christians had anything to do. I don't think there was any story involving Christians and the burning of Rome. I think that was invented centuries later and got inserted into Tacitus. That it was originally Messianic Jews who got persecuted. It wasn't Christians at all. So on that assumption, then you have to say, well, how would you say the Revelation was written before Tacitus? Then you say, well, how would the author of Revelation know about it? There's two problems with this. One is it's very vague, so we don't really know that that's what the author of Revelation is talking about. But more significantly is the author of Revelation is a Torah observant Christian. Revelation is one of the texts that's anti-Paul. So the Revelation is written by a community of Christians who believe that you have to convert to Judaism. You have to be a Jew to be saved. You can't be a Christian and not be Torah observant. You got to get circumcised. You got to follow the dietary laws and stuff. So Revelation is still a pro-Jewish text. It's countercultural, so it's anti-Jewish elite, but it's still pro-Jewish in that sense. So if it is the case, and I do think it is the case, that it was Messianic Jews that got persecuted by Nero, that still becomes relevant to bring in into Revelation, because it's sort of an example of how these horrible things are happening to us meaning devout Jews. And so there's still an explanation that could get in there, but I think ultimately the text is too vague to really be sure, like, what are they talking about exactly? Are they just talking about the general horrors of Nero? Are they talking about the general fact of the fire? And it's like there's no specific story in there where it says, the Christians were specifically murdered en masse for blamed for arson for this particular fire. Revelation doesn't say that, so it's hard to really reconstruct what it's referring to per se. But there's still a narrative where that would make sense, even if the Christian element got added later, because they identify a lot with the punishment of the Jews and the abuse of the Jews in Book of Revelation. So that's important to the author in a way that I guess could become unclear if you're thinking that this is an organized Bible of all, anti-Semitic Gentile Christian texts. No, the New Testament is a mixture of books that are in argument with each other. Like Matthew was written by Torah observant Christians to refute Mark. He's arguing with Mark. And Luke is arguing with Mark and Matthew, where he's saying, can't we all get along? And John is saying, fuck you all, we have a new religion now. Like, it's like they're all arguing with each other. And they just get collected into this text because each of these texts brings a community with it. And it was political in terms of which communities do we want to be on our side versus the ones we're going to try and oppose and kick out, right? And so I think that's why all these contradictory books got slammed together in the Bible. It's a political decision in the same way that the Nicene Creed is a political decision. It makes no logical sense,
right,
but it makes perfect sense politically. If you pick, like, these are the sects we want to be insiders, those are the sects we want to be outsiders, if that's your starting position, what is our creed? The answer is this gobbledygook, this contradictory gobbledygook called the Nicene Creed, right? So the best description of that, by the way, is Bart Ehrman in How Jesus Became God. He has a chapter near the end that's just on the Nicene Creed, and it's the best description of how the Nicene Creed was a product of political committees. Has nothing to do with truth, fact, or theology, even, really. And I think the same thing happened with how did what became our canonical edition of the Bible. How it got assembled is the same thing. And so once you understand that these texts come from radically different groups who were at each other's throats originally, then you can understand what's going on in Revelation in some of these odd respects.
Thank you. We're going to have to blast through some of these here, Dr. Carrier. Gray's 174. Would you rather publicly fight or debate Frank Turek?
Wait a minute, Frank Turek.
Why Frank Turek?
Why wouldn't I debate Frank Turek? Is there something I'm forgetting?
They're just being funny.
Okay. No, I mean, there are people I would not debate, but I don't think Frank Turek is on the list unless I've forgotten something. But no, yeah, I would debate Frank Turek again. I don't like debates, but if someone organizes a debate, I'll come. I'm expensive, but not that expensive, but.
I think you're reasonable. Yeah, you're
I'm actually reasonable. If you want to do a physical in-person debate, the biggest expense is travel. Right, physically getting me there. People should know I'm now in Georgia. I'm in the Atlanta area, so no longer in California. Other side of the country now, so it affects people's decisions on that. But yeah, I would debate him. I don't see any reason to fight him.
Someone set it up. They also say, have you ever interacted with Eastern Orthodoxy? I don't.
I mean, I've engaged with Eastern Orthodoxists in person, and I studied it a little. So I'm not completely in the dark, but I've never written anything about it. No.
Okay. They also asked, didn't catch the whole stream, but is Luke lying here, or is there an internally noble thought process?
Aren't those the same thing? don't many liars have noble reasons for their lies?
That's a good point.
No, I think absolutely. It's both, right? Yeah. Luke is totally lying. He knows it's full of shit. But he does believe that he's rescuing the world. Like he does think that people need to come around to his way of thinking. Or else all hell will break loose or whatever. Like he's sincere in his agenda, but he's completely dishonest in the way he's going about achieving it.
We Are Alliance says off topic, but can you talk about the all-seeing eye of Jehovah some other time? The Tetragrammaton. Check out some old Jehovah coins.
I don't know a lot about numismatics, Jewish Israeli numismatics. That's not my area. Yeah, if you were going to talk about like the Tetragrammaton on coins, you need to get someone who's an expert in ancient coins.
Thank you. Gettysburg Demoniac. Since the miracles in the Gospels are fictional, why did the original disciples think Jesus was the Messiah during his lifetime?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, you're talking to someone who doesn't believe Jesus existed, so. Right. The reason is because he appeared in a dream and told them, and then gave them powers, right? They can faith heal and call out demons and things like that. And so therefore it must be true, right? It must have actually been a real Jesus that appeared to them in their dreams. No, I think that's like in my own model of how Christianity began. It was that they had a God appear to them in their dreams or their ecstatic states. Told them there were these hidden messages in scripture. They found them and they're like, oh my God, this is brilliant. It has to be true. And then they went and did standard psychosomatic miracle tent shows and said, oh my God, we can heal people, etc. And then believed it. I think that's what happened. But if you're on a model of a historical Jesus, there's like 100 different models of a historical Jesus as to how people would believe that they're real. Some of it's largely the same. Like how does anyone believe that Q of QAnon is some sort of like brilliant mystical inside leader that makes only good decisions, right? How did people come to believe that David Koresh was the chosen one of God? Like you could just go through history and right. Ask that same question. It's easy to find followers, Jim Jones, etc. Like there are storylines as to how, and they don't all do it the same way, but it's mostly charisma and it's mostly emotion. It's mostly this bad epistemology. People aren't deciding who's the Messiah based on evidence-based rational reasoning. They're doing it based on like how they feel. It's based on feelings, and so there's a lot of different ways to manipulate people to feel that you are the Messiah. And we know that throughout history. In the Sabbatai Sevi, like even Rastafari like denied to his the whole time, I'm not the fucking Messiah. Don't worship me. And the Rastafarians are still a thing. Like they're still worshiping him. He himself told them to stop, and they're still doing it. So, so there's lots of ways this can happen. And because the evidence is so problematic and vague, it's difficult to know which of these pathways happened for Jesus, if he existed historically. We can talk about different models that would make sense in the context. And I think there's lots of plausible historical Jesuses that would answer that question.
Thank you so much. What arguments of Paul were most persuasive, effective in converting Gentiles to Christianity or to believe Jesus was raised from the dead?
Well, we talked about the last part earlier, and I talk about this in more detail for people who are interested. Again, in The Scientist and the Early Roman Empire, I have a section on their epistemology and how can you do miracles? Do you suffer? Is your teaching moral? If you do those three things, then you must be telling the truth, and Jesus must have risen from the dead. Why would you lie about it? Because you're clearly of God, right? That's their thinking. It's irrational thinking, but it is how they thought. And so that's the answer to that question. As far as marketing goes, we already know, we have tons of evidence that there were tons of Gentiles who were already attracted to Judaism. And you could talk about like why, like what was it? It was appealing. But they didn't convert to Judaism because they didn't like cutting off a piece of their penis. They didn't like the dietary rules. Like the rules were too strict. But they did really admire the sort of intense piety and some of the, the brotherhood and the sort of sincerity. There were aspects of the Jewish life that really appealed to people, but they wouldn't become Jewish. And so they became God-fearers. So they became supporters of synagogues, but they weren't themselves Jewish. That was a ready-made market. Like Paul just had to walk up to them. Hey, you want to be Jewish without cutting off a piece of your penis? And like, yeah, that's great. Finally, I've been looking for this. And so he had a huge market to sell to. And a lot of those people had money. And so he's bringing in sacks of cash. He talks about it in his letters. There's a lot of suspicion thrown at him about what are you doing with all this sacks of cash, Paul? And he's like, no, I swear I'm taking it to the saints back in Jerusalem. I'm taking it probably, which means, Peter, James and stuff. So here's this guy, he's coming back with sacks of cash. And it's like, hey, look, I got this new gospel, sacks of cash. And they're like, well, okay, maybe we can be a little flexible on the conversion thing. Right. So I sincerely think that is literally what happened. And I think wow, we could have all this money that we can use for our mission. Let Paul convert the Gentiles with this stuff. We'll use the money we get to like push it onto the Jews. And so like get more Jews on board. And then we can finally bring paradise on earth. Like that's probably how they thought, right? I think that's probably what's going on.
Thank you. Gray 174. What's the relationship with Torah, Christianity, and Islam? Was Jesus a prophet or of Allah this whole time?
So I have an article on the historicity of Muhammad. Don't get excited. I don't come to a conclusion on that. The article is mostly about how we can't know the answer to that question. But in the article, I talk about the fact that there is some serious scholarship, and I think there's a good basis for it, suggesting that Islam is actually a remnant, an evolved remnant of one of the early original sects of Christianity, that it's evolved from a Torah observant sect into a halal observant sect, because halal and kosher are very similar. You might wonder, like, why are they so similar? And there's a lot of aspects of the Quran that look similar to Peshitta and Syrian Christianity. And so you can see, like, well, maybe there was some sort of like little sect of still hanging around of the original Christian sect of Torah observant Christians hundreds of years later. And just like their beliefs sort of evolved and changed. And then boom, they've got an army and they're, going all over the world with like gangbusters spreading this thing. And so it looks like Islam popped out of nowhere, but that's only because it might have just been this little remnant that just, Game of Thrones its way into having military power, and then suddenly shoots onto the literary scene where we can see them. The evidence survives for us to see their presence, but they might have been there all along. So Islam might actually just be a sect of Christianity in much the way that Mormonism is. And so I think that's entirely possible and plausible. And there are other scholars who've argued this.
Thank you so much. There's so much we don't have time for, but 7 minutes here. How confident are you that Acts was written by a single author?
Books usually were. So I give it more than 80% chance. Like, it would be very weird for multiple authors to be involved. Not so weird as to be like that would never happen. We have examples, I think, where we believe in multiple authorship. And then there's redaction, of course, which is a different question. Like, our version of Acts might have been redacted by multiple authors after the original. Right. So that's a different. Well, that's the Gospel of John. Is that it's our Gospel of John is not what the original author wrote. It's been redacted by two different authors since, but they're separate authors getting the text and changing it, and then moving it, and the next guy comes along and changes it. As far as like a committee of authors, that's uncommon. So I would need evidence for it before I would believe that happened. It's not impossible. It's just not what we would statistically expect.
Thank you, Mark Benson. Marabara, a fist fight between Richard and Bart Ehrman. Who wins?
I don't fight people unless my life is threatened. So if Bart Ehrman is trying to physically kill me, I think I do pretty well. But I've got some moves. But otherwise, I'm not going to have a fist fight with people. I don't believe in the use of violence in that way.
I guess I should start. So before we move to the next question, just for the sake of the poll, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll where it's at. Do you think the Book of Acts is a historical fiction? Yes. So the numbers are 56% said yes, 21% said no, and 21% said not sure. Exactly those numbers, 816 votes. We're starting a new poll based on this super chat. Who would win in a fight? Bart?
Yeah. People might, as if they're good gamblers, they might want to have background information. As I am ex-military, but
yeah. I'm going to put Richard or Bart.
Also, I'm willing to bet I drink a lot more.
Okay, so I asked the question.
Take a hit.
We only have a few minutes to answer this question. Thank you so much for the fun question. Christy, do you see anything with the stories of the New Testament revolutionaries being Protestants to Judaism and the founders of America? Capitol Hill in D.C. was named after the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on Capitoline Hill.
Okay. Looking for an analogy here.
I think so.
Well, the word revolutionary is a bit misleading. So cultural revolutionaries. Yeah, right. I would say, I mean, I don't know. The analogy is weak because it's not like Paul walked up to the temple and put 99 theses or whatever on the thing. But in a sense, it is a revolution cult. And I talk about there's an anthropology of this. There's a lot of studies of revolution cults throughout the ethnographic record across history. And I have element 29 in chapter 5 of On the Historicity of Jesus. I talk about the anthropological literature on revolution cults and why Christianity fits it to a T. Absolutely. I don't know that. I think Protestantism doesn't, because Protestantism was weirdly a much more rational political movement. It wasn't a visionary revelatory movement. Like, there weren't people claiming new visions, and it wasn't from the bottom up. It was a top-down movement. It got aligned with politics very quickly. So it was elite power players were involved. So, and it was more like a rational political objection to the way the Catholic Church had become corrupted. So I think that Protestantism is not considered a revolution cult. It's a very different process. So it would be hard to like build out the analogy, or maybe not fruitful to build out the analogy, other than the fact that they are religious reform movements, that they definitely have that in common.
Thank you. Warren says Richard eternally looks like he's in his 20s.
Yeah, it's weird, right?
You're going to be like getting old looking young. Dan Johnson says, as a janitor with 4 kids, I can't give as often as someone should, but glad to support when I can. Thank you for always great content. Yeah. LBUI. What's that mean?
Oh gosh, text. I would Google it normally. Someone will throw it in there.
Yeah, someone tell me in the chat what LBUI. Dan, thank you so much. You didn't have to. I really do appreciate the support, and I'm going to keep bringing the fire. So,
it's support like that allows him to bring me on shows. So,
yeah,
if you want to see more of me, throw some more money at him. So
that's literally what I called Richard. I said, "Hey, man," and I've got
how the economy works. Yeah.
Yep. I really do appreciate the support, everybody, for making this possible. And then Ann Scott says, what does Dr. Carrier think about Paul's Pesher being the original or actual Q?
Well, it wouldn't be because, so a Pesher would be a collection of verses, and it might have an interpretation attached. So it might, this verse is connected to this verse, and this is why, etc. What that is, if we build out Q, which is just literally Q, just means everything that Luke copied from Matthew that isn't in Mark. So if you build that out, it doesn't look like a Pesher. It looks like a gospel, actually. It looks like the Gospel of Matthew, honestly. That's why I think that's all it is. No, it looks like a gospel. It doesn't look like a Pesher. It could be a collection. It could be something like, let's take Dennis MacDonald's model, where it's Q plus. He has a much more elaborate version of Q that he argues for, where he argues that this was a story that predates Mark and told. That totally could predate Christianity. It could be a document, a story about some hero of yore. It could have been originally like someone set in the time of Daniel or whatever, and then someone just used that to write a modern story about Jesus. And we have examples of that being done. So I think that is a plausible model. I don't think that's what happened, but it could have. It could be something like that, where you have, it was a story about someone else, some other religious hero hundreds of years ago, that they just adapted, and we just don't know that because we don't have that story to build out from.
Richard, I really appreciate your time. Dr. Richard Carrier.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Great questions from everybody. Thank you.
And there's much more we could have gotten into, but I had tried to get through my first hour. I kind of try to take the first hour and then give the rest for audience.
I think we did a really excellent use of time. It's fantastic.
I think so too. Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, Proving History. You have several more, of course. Jesus from Outer Space is kind of a condensed version of On the Historicity. If you're interested in more exhaustive, you can get these on Audible. You can listen to them. Go literally subscribe to his, it doesn't cost anything. Go subscribe to his email list. You can support him more in ways like taking his online courses that he does through his own website. We have one through MVP courses that's all in 4K, high quality, and we have more to come as time goes by. We're going to be putting out 4 more courses with you. We also have your Patreon. You have a way of personal support. Is there anything else I'm missing here?
No, I think you've got all of that. There's lots of different ways to support my work. And even if you want to list more on my website, one of the top menu is how to help. And it lists them all. So including like where to get my books. That's one way to help. How to give donations, how to support me on Patreon, and all of that stuff.
Literally tells you right here how to help. I'll put the info support link in the comment section in case someone wants to go over there, show you some love, or they want to be emailed. Like I get emailed every time you launch. How common is it that how often are you publishing? Because
I do 4 blogs, four blogs a month. Occasionally do more than that, but only 4 substantive blogs. I'll do sometimes, if I do a physical appearance, I'll announce it on my blog, but all other appearances are only on my social media. So they're announced on Twitter and Facebook. There is actually on my website, there is a guide to my social media. So if you want to know where to follow me based on what your interests are, you've got that. I also have a guide to my books. You can search for guide to my books, and it lists all my books and why you might be interested in which ones. So that's there as well. But the thing that I think that matters the most, the thing that I've really is keeping me in biscuits and doing this as a living, is Patreon supporters. And Patreon supporters get a lot of perks, especially if you like communicate with me and remind me that you're a Patreon supporter. You get more access to me than the average Joe, basically. So Patreon, support me on Patreon.
You can also comment and instantly be approved to comment.
Yeah, that's one of the perks. And on Patreon, it'll tell you what the perks are. One of which is that on my blog, your comments go straight through. They get whitelisted and they don't go through the queue. Once you become a Patreon member, it might take me like a month to get you on that whitelist, but every month I go in and I update the whitelist. And so once you're on the whitelist, you can post comments to my blogs and it posts immediately. So, and that means that you could even start engaging with other Patreon members on my blog in the comments, because your comments post immediately. Whereas everyone else, it goes to moderation, and it could take days before I get in and approve everything. So yeah, one of the big, that's one of the big perks. The other is if you want to be a Facebook friend, I only allow people to comment on my Facebook posts who are Facebook friends, and Patreon members are automatically, you can request to be a Facebook friend. Just say I'm a Patreon member and you're in.
Awesome. Well, I can tell you this much. I know for a fact, if it weren't for those who've helped support us through Patreon, we wouldn't be here. And that goes for Dr. Carrier as well. So support the scholars you appreciate. It's really about just putting money where you want to see more of that kind of content from that kind of scholar. I've noticed that with MythVision. And so I say the same for you. MNAC came in, dropped heavy supporting at the end here. Hey, Derek, I
already saw it, so I'm ready to answer. And I can answer quick.
Well, I've been busy and just catching up. So, Doctor, what do you think about today's Christian nationals, and would you consider them revolutionary or dangerous?
Dangerous as fuck. Google brown shirts. I think they're basically our era's version.
Wow. Okay. MNAC, thank you so much for that big drop of money there. You helped us out here. And Dr. Carrier, help support Dr. Carrier. If you love what you heard, never forget to check us out in the description as well. We do have a course. You can purchase that as well with him. So any final words from you before we let you go?
No, this has been great. Good discussion. Covered all the topics, I think, pretty well. Check out my website. Check out how to help. There might be ideas in there for how to have me on. And if any of you are content creators, get in touch. I'm affordable. So
yeah, very affordable.
Yes. Right.
And you really just go above and beyond. You understand that we are trying to do super chats. We're trying to keep doing what we're doing here. And I just, my whole goal with this was initially just let me cover what it costs to have you on, because I love educating. And I know time is money and we all have to eat. And so I wanted to just make sure that we could somehow cover that by the super chats. And we did. So I want to thank everybody for helping us today, make that possible. And I guess have a wonderful day. Take care of yourself. I've been exercising. I've been bragging about it to Dr. Carrier. Like I've been trying to get back in shape before COVID, that kind of thing. And I hope that everybody else takes care of their bodies and sticks around. Keep sharing this content, drop a comment, and support those you want to see more of. So thank you so much.
All righty.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.